Hello, friends. In this lesson, we're going to look at some idioms and expressions in American English that come from the idea that life is like a story. Everybody loves stories. Stories tell us about life, but sometimes we think about our life like it is a story, like it's a book written down somewhere that somebody else is reading. So a story has a narrative. It's got something specific that's happening. It has a beginning and a middle and an end. And many stories are written down in books. So related to this idea that life is like a story is the idea that a person is a book. So in these idioms and expressions, we will use and look at a lot of vocabulary related to reading and to books. So a book has cover, a book has pages, a book has words and lines, and we read a book. And we're going to hear a lot of these words in these expressions in this lesson. So the first expression, you've probably heard it before, is actually a proverb. And the proverb is, don't judge a book by its cover. But we can say this a few different ways. We can say never judge a book by its cover. We can say don't judge a book by its cover. Or we can say you can't judge a book by its cover. And this is said to show that you cannot know what something or someone is like by looking only at that person or the thing's appearance, the way that it looks. So for example, if we look at this book here, we can't know anything about this book just by looking at the cover of the book, because the cover is blank. We don't even know the title of this book. So the only way we can get to know this book is by opening it up and reading it. So you can't judge a book by its cover. We use this a lot with people, meaning that you can't understand or know somebody or what they're like just by looking at their outside or their appearance. For example, he seemed like a bit of a jerk to me, but I guess you can't judge a book by its cover, meaning that this person might look like a jerk or a kind of a mean person on the outside, but when you get to know them, that might be a very nice and kind person. Maybe they were just having a bad day or something. The next one here is to call someone an open book. So if you say he's an open book or she's an open book, this means that they are easy to know about because nothing is kept secret. So this is the kind of person who doesn't keep secrets. They are exactly what you see, and there's nothing hidden about this person. Just like a book, an open book, you can see exactly what's inside of it. For example, ask me anything, I'm an open book. Or sometimes somebody might say my life is an open book. That means I don't hide anything from other people. The opposite of this is to call someone a closed book. So a closed book is someone that is very difficult to understand. For example, she is such a private person that I don't know much about her. I guess she's a closed book. So you can think about the people that you know in life. I'm sure some of them are open books and some of them are closed books, meaning they're hard to get to know because they don't give you a lot of details about themselves. They don't talk a lot. The next expression here is to say in one's book. So in my book or in your book or in his book or in her book. This just means in someone's opinion. For example, she's never lied to me, and in my book, that counts for a lot. So if somebody says in my book, that just means in their opinion. Like they're writing a book down about life, right? So, oh, you're okay in my book, or this is a pretty good restaurant in my book. That just means in my opinion. The next expression is when we say that someone literally wrote the book on something, or someone wrote the book on something. All right, so we're going to ignore this word first. If we say someone wrote the book on something, we say this to describe someone who is very knowledgeable or experienced on a certain subject. So if you say, oh, he wrote the book on that, that means he knows a lot about that subject. It doesn't actually mean that they wrote a book. It just means that they know a lot about it or they have a lot of experience about it. Now, if we say someone literally wrote the book on something, that means that both they are knowledgeable or experienced and they actually wrote a book on the subject. So if they say literally, that means they're both knowledgeable and they actually wrote a book. But if you don't hear literally, if they just say someone wrote the book, that just means they're very knowledgeable or experienced on the subject. For example, I don't know how to use Instagram. You should go ask John. He pretty much wrote the book on social media. So if I say he wrote the book on social media, that just means he knows a lot about it. It doesn't actually mean he wrote a book. Now, if I said he literally wrote the book on social media, that would mean that he's knowledgeable and he actually wrote a book. This next one here is between the lines or read between the lines. So to read between the lines is to understand what someone or something means even when it's not clearly or openly stated. For example, she said she could afford it, but reading between the lines, I don't think she has enough money. So reading between the lines, if we think about a book, in a book, the book has lines. All the words are in lines, but in between the lines are spaces, right? So when we say in between the lines, we don't actually mean in between the lines. We mean, what is it saying? What is it not saying, but it means, right? So sometimes somebody will say something to you, but they're not telling you clearly what they mean. You have to think about what they mean. So you have to read between the lines. So if we look at this picture here, we can see this person is thinking about a conversation that they had, trying to understand what did this person mean that they were not saying clearly. So reading between the lines is when you're trying to understand what somebody means, but they didn't actually say it. To read into something or to read something into something is to give your own meaning to something rather than what was intended. So this one is similar to reading between the lines, but it's different because when you read between the lines, this is something that somebody actually meant. Even though they didn't say it directly or clearly, they actually meant it. When you read into something, then that means you're giving your own meaning to something they said. They didn't actually mean it. For example, this statement means exactly what it says. Don't try to read anything else into it, right? And we get this a lot with text messaging or social media, because in social media or text messaging, we're trying to say a lot with just a few words. So sometimes, like if you're in a bad mood and you read somebody else's text message, even though they weren't in a bad mood when they wrote it or they didn't mean anything mean, you're reading into it. You're like, oh, what do they mean by that, right? Well, maybe they didn't mean anything by it. Maybe they're just saying, you look nice, and you're thinking, well, what do they mean by that? Do they really mean I look nice, or are they trying to say something else? So when you're reading into it, that means you're giving your own meaning to it. To turn over a new leaf means to change your behavior in a positive way. Okay, so this one here, when we say leaf, we don't mean like from a tree. A leaf was an old word for like a page of paper. So here we can see this piece of paper. We could call this a leaf. So like sometimes when we're turning the pages in a book, we can say we're leafing through the book. So to turn over a new leaf means to turn to a new page in the book. So it means to change your behavior in a positive way, because it's like you're turning to a new page in the book of your life, a blank page, so you can do whatever you want on the new page. For example, she turned over a new leaf and began getting to work on time. So maybe this person was always late to work, and she decided, oh, I don't want to be late to work anymore. I'm going to try to be on time every day. So that would be turning over a new leaf. This one gets used quite a bit, especially around New Year's time, because a lot of people, especially in America, they make New Year's resolutions. So January 1st, that's the beginning of the year. So they make a resolution to do something new, like they're going to start exercising more, or they're going to start eating better, or they're going to, watch less TV or something. So they make a resolution. We can also call this turning over a new leaf. We're going to start trying to do something new. We're going to try to change our behavior in a positive way. The next expression here is to borrow or take a leaf or page out of someone's book. So we can hear this a few different ways. Again, we're using this idea of a leaf, like a leaf of paper. It's a piece of paper. So if we borrow a page or borrow a leaf out of someone's book, or take a page or take a leaf out of someone's book, we're basically doing the same thing that they've done. So if you see somebody doing something and you like the way that they do it, and you start trying to do that in the same way, then you're taking a page out of their book, or you're taking a leaf out of their book. For example, if I want to pass this test, maybe I should take a page out of her book. She's always getting A's, right? So if you see somebody doing something in a good way, and you're like, oh, I want to do the same thing, then you're taking a page out of their book, or you're taking a leaf out of their book. The next expression here is to start or begin a new chapter in your life, or the next chapter in your life. So again, if your life is like a book has chapters in it. So when you start a new chapter, That means you're making a big change in life to do something different, such as moving to a new place, starting a new job or career, getting married or divorced, etc. So the new chapter or the next chapter in your life is when you have a big life change. For example, I'm excited to finish my program, graduate, and start a new chapter in my life. So if you're a student, like if you're a college student, you could say that this is the chapter in your life, the chapter about you being a college student, right? But when you graduate, then you're starting a new chapter that's going on to your career, right? So that's the next chapter in your life. So you can start a new chapter, you can begin a new chapter, or the next chapter in your life. The next expression here is to close the book on something. Close the book. So to close the book on something means to end or complete something, especially something unhappy or unpleasant. So after you finish reading a book, you close it. So you're done with that book. For example, here, after his divorce, he wanted to close the book on that part of his life. So he moved to a new city. So a divorce is an unpleasant thing. It's unhappy. So once you're finished with it, you close the book on that part of your life, meaning being married before or whatever. So closing the book is to complete or end something, especially something unhappy or unpleasant. This next expression is, it's like a direction. Somebody might say, read my lips. Read my lips. They don't actually mean to read their lips. Read my lips is a slightly rude way of telling someone to listen carefully to what you're saying. For example, read my lips. You're not going, and that's final. So read my lips just means listen carefully to what I'm saying. It doesn't actually mean to read my mouth, even though people can do that. It just means to listen carefully. This one became very popular from the first President Bush, George H.W. Bush. He said, read my lips, no new taxes. So he was promising the American people that he wasn't going to create any new taxes. He said, read my lips, no new taxes. And then I believe he did actually go make new taxes. So he went back on his promise there. But read my lips, it just means to listen carefully to what you're saying. To read someone like a book, or to read someone, is to understand easily what somebody is thinking or feeling. So again, if a person is like a book, then you read a book, which means you can also read a person. So if you read a person, you understand what they're thinking or feeling. For example, I know what you're thinking. I can read you like a book. So it just means it's easy to understand what they're thinking or feeling, to read them. To get a read on someone, this is similar to this. It's to try to understand what someone is thinking or feeling. So to read someone like a book, or to read someone, means you do understand what they're thinking or feeling. To get a read on them is to try to understand what they're thinking or feeling, or to try to figure out what they're like. For example, he doesn't say much and he's very private, so it's hard to get a read on him, So here we can see, like at a job interview, if you're going for a job interview, you're trying to understand what each person that's interviewing you is thinking. What's he thinking? What's she thinking? What's he thinking? What kind of a person is he? What kind of a person is she? What kind of a person is he? So when you're trying to understand this, when you're trying to think about it, you're trying to get a read on them. And the same, the people that are interviewing you are trying to get a read on you. They're trying to understand what you're like and who you are. Similar to this is calling somebody a tough read or a hard read, or it's to say that they're hard to read. So if you call somebody a tough read or a hard read, or say that they're hard to read, it means that someone whose actions or behavior are difficult to understand. So if you can read them, then you do understand them. If you're trying to get a read on them, that means you're trying to understand them. If you say that they're a hard to read or they're a hard read, that means you've tried to understand them, you tried to get a read, but you can't. They're very difficult to understand, right? For example, a lot of people didn't feel comfortable with Hillary Clinton because she was a hard read. Nobody ever knew what she was really like. So a lot of people said with Hillary Clinton, when she was running for president, like she seemed one way on the outside, but that she seemed like maybe she wasn't that way really, behind closed doors, we say, in private, what was she like? So we could call her a hard to read or a tough read. And you can see here, like this boy's trying to read a book and you can tell he's having a hard time. So imagine this book as a person. He's just having a hard time understanding that person. To read someone's mind is to know what they're thinking without being told. For example, how did you know I wanted that CD for my birthday? You must have read my mind. Now, we can tell this is an old example because very few people use CDs anymore. But when somebody knows what you're thinking, you can say that they read your mind. You read my mind. Related to this is to call somebody a mind reader. So to read someone's mind, this is the verb form. To be a mind reader, this is the noun form. So a mind reader is a person who knows what somebody else is thinking without being told. For example, please just tell me what you mean. I'm not a mind reader. And men tell this to women a lot, right? I'm not a mind reader. Just tell me what you want. To have something written on your face or all over your face, this is used for saying that the expression on your face or the way that you look shows what you are feeling or thinking. So your face is telling me everything I need to know. So to have something written all over your face means I can look at you and I know exactly what you're thinking or feeling. For example, I could tell he got the job. He had it written all over his face. That doesn't mean anything is written on your face. It just means the way that you look tells me everything I need to know, whether you're happy or whether you're sad or something else. The opposite of this is to have a blank expression or a blank look on your face, right? So to have something written all over your face, it's very clear what you're thinking or feeling. To have a blank expression or a blank look means that it's very difficult to understand what you're thinking or feeling. So we use this to describe when someone's face shows no emotion or reaction to something. It's also used when someone doesn't seem to understand something. So this could have two slightly different meanings. A blank expression, it just means that looking at their face, you don't know what they're thinking or feeling. So they have a blank expression or look on their face. Blank coming from the idea of like a blank page, right? So if you look at this, there's nothing written there. So I don't know anything by looking at this page. Now, if you look at this guy's face here, right? You can't tell if he's happy, if he's sad, if he's excited, if he's nervous. You can't tell anything. He has a blank expression on his face. If you have watched the video on idioms and expressions that come from poker and gambling, there is an expression in that video called poker face, to have a poker face. So this guy here, he's playing poker, so he has a poker face. But we can also say he has a blank expression. So a poker face or a blank expression are very similar to each other. So here he's trying to hide what he's thinking or feeling. That's why he has a blank expression. Sometimes somebody has a blank expression or look because they don't understand what's going on. So let's look at the examples here. It's hard to know what he's thinking since he's always got a blank expression. So here he just doesn't show what he's thinking or feeling. Look at the second example here. Most of the students had blank looks on their faces when the teacher started talking about speech act theory. So here, this means that the students didn't understand what the teacher was talking about. So sometimes people have a blank expression because they're trying to hide something. Sometimes they have a blank expression because they don't understand. The next expression here is to make a long story short or to cut a long story short. So to make a long story short, we use this when we're saying that we'll get to the main point of what we're saying quickly without including all the details. So if you're trying to tell somebody something that happened, trying to tell them a story, but you don't have a lot of time or you don't want to take a lot of time to tell it, you'll cut out a lot of the details. So you might say, well, to make a long story short, and then you'll get to the main point. For example, to make a long story short, we didn't get home until 3 in the morning. So if somebody didn't get home until 3 in the morning, then obviously something happened, right? But here they're not really telling us what happened. They're just saying, well, to make a long story short. That means they're cutting out the details. So you can see here in the picture, it looks like President Obama's telling these guys something, but they're all checking their watches, like they don't have a lot of time. I don't know if that's what's happening here, but that's what it looks like. So he might say, well, to make a long story short, and get to his main point. Related to this is to say it's a long story, right? So to cut a long story short or to make a long story short means you're going to cut out a lot of details when you're telling a story. To just tell somebody it's a long story means you're not even going to tell them what happened. So we say this when something strange or unpleasant has happened and you don't want to take the time to explain when someone asks about it. Why didn't I get my homework done? It's a long story. So to make a long story short, you are telling them something, you're just cutting out the details. To say that it's a long story means you're not really telling them anything. So something strange or unpleasant happened and you don't want to talk about it. You don't want to tell the whole story. You just say, oh, it's a long story. Another expression here is to say that it's the story of my life or that's the story of my life. We say this when something bad happens to you that has happened to you many times before. For example, after 6 months of sending in applications and resumes, I finally got a job interview. Then my car broke down on the way to the interview. Story of my life. It just means that bad things keep happening to you or strange things keep happening to you. And so in that moment, when something bad or strange happens again, you say, oh, it's a story of my life. To say or to ask what's his story or what's her story, we use this to ask for information about someone that we don't know much about, especially when there's something unusual about them. For example, have you met the new guy at work who wears headphones all the time? What's his story? So if you want to learn more about somebody from somebody else, like if you're at a party and you see somebody that looks interesting or unusual, you might ask somebody, hey, what's his story or what's her story? The next expression is so the story goes or so the story goes. Okay, so sometimes we use the word or before it. So the story goes, we use this to describe something that people are saying, so like a story that they're passing on, although it may not be correct. It just means that they're telling what they heard. For example, then they got married and lived happily ever after, or so the story goes. So if you're just passing on a story that you heard, it might not be true, it might not be correct, you're just passing it on, right? So we can say, or the story goes. So that's why I've got the picture here of forwarding, right? So when we forward stories or forward emails, sometimes we don't check to make sure that what we're forwarding is true. We're just passing it on to somebody else or to other people. And so this is what the idea is for so the story goes. It means we're just passing on some information or we're giving people a story even though we haven't checked to make sure that it's all correct. Or maybe we think that maybe it isn't true. The next expression here is that it's a likely story. So we can say that's a likely story or it's a likely story. We use this to show that we do not believe what somebody has said. So if somebody tells us something and we just don't believe it, we can say, oh, that's a likely story. For example, he said he couldn't make it to class because he was having car trouble. A likely story. You can see here this guy, you can tell he doesn't believe what he's hearing. So we might tell somebody else, oh, it's a likely story. That means we don't believe what somebody else told us. The next expression here is to talk about someone's side of the story. So the side of the story. This is your account or your telling of what happened when someone else gives a different account or a different telling of what happened. For example, I'd like to hear his side of the story as well. So if you look at the picture here, we have probably a husband and wife and they're talking to a therapist. So she's telling her side of the story. Now, when he talks about what happened, he might give a different story. He might give different details. So that would be his side of the story. So there's her side of the story and then there's his side of the story. Sometimes people also say he said, she said, right? So different sides of the story. To be on the same page is to understand and agree with what is being done or suggested. For example, I think we're all on the same page. So to say that we're on the same page means that we agree about it or we understand each other. It's the idea that you're all reading a book and you're all on the same page in the book. If you would just agree with somebody or understand what they're saying, you can say, oh, we're on the same page. Or if you want to check to see if they agree or understand what you're saying, you might say, I just wanted to make sure that we're on the same page. I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page. To turn the page on something or to turn the page is to make a transition to something else, especially a more positive period after a negative one. So this is like the next chapter or moving on. For example, last year was kind of a bad year for me, so I'm hoping to turn the page and have a much better year this year. So it's like another page is like a new day in your life, right? So to turn the page is to change to something else, to make a transition, hopefully to something more positive after a negative period. So this one is different than turn over a new leaf. So if we turn over a new leaf, that means we're trying to start doing something new, like to start a new habit. But to turn the page just means to move on to something new in your life, to move on to a new period of your life. And then we have this expression, which is actually a word, telltale. Telltale. So if we look at this word, we can divide it into two. We have tale. Here, a tale is another word for a story. Another word for a story. So telltale means something that is telling a story. So we can say telltale signs. This means something that's happening or something that we can see that's giving us information. It's telling us a story. This means giving information or evidence about something that is true. For example, when you see birds start to fly south, it is a telltale sign that winter is coming. So here you can see the birds. Now the birds can't tell me anything because they can't speak. But by looking at the birds, this is a sign, right? So looking at them, this is a sign. Okay, why are they flying like this? They're going south. Oh, they're going south. That means winter is coming. So I could call this a telltale sign because just looking at the birds is telling me information. It's telling me a story about what's going on in the world. So telltale signs are things that we can look at that give us information about a situation. It's like we look at it and it's telling us a story about something. And then we have the narrative. So the narrative is a description of something that people generally believe is true, but is often not true or is not the complete truth. So when we're looking at a book or a story, the narrative is basically what happens, right, in a story. So like for example, romance books, the narrative is that a man meets a woman, the two people fall in love, and they often get married. That's the narrative. So the narrative is the way that the story normally goes. That's the narrative. But when we use this as an expression to talk about the narrative, it's a description of something that people generally believe is true, but is often not true, and is not the complete truth. For example, for most Americans, the narrative about Africa is that it is poor and full of war. So when Americans generally think about Africa, they think about a bunch of poor people and they think about a lot of warfare going on. But that's not the complete truth about Africa. But this is what a lot of people think about. This is the narrative that a lot of Americans have about Africa, even though it's not completely true about Africa. So we call this a narrative because it's just what people think about. It's the story they think about, but it's not completely true or not true at all. Now, you'll often see this with a word in between the and narrative. For example, here we can say the media narrative. So this means the story that the media, like the news, tells people about something. So the media narrative, we could say the media narrative about Donald Trump was that, he was all of these bad things, right? So that would be the narrative. Now, is that completely true? No, it's not completely true. There might be some good things, there might be some bad things, but the media narrative was basically that he was completely bad. So the media has narratives for many things, and it depends on which media you watch too. So if you watch Fox News, they'll have one narrative about guns, for example, and gun ownership. If you watch MSNBC, they're going to have a different narrative about guns, right? Guns are bad. Fox News, guns are good. So each media source has their own narrative about what's happening in the world. So you'll hear this one a lot, especially when you read or listen to the news. People will talk about the narrative. So that's it for the expressions in this metaphor. Life is a story or a person is a book. Thanks for watching.